Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I'm Patrick Lewis. I'm the president and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's program, which is sponsored in honor of the Association for Teaching Black History in Kentucky, the Thomas D. Clark Foundation, Berea College, and the University Press of Kentucky, all wonderful partners with the Filson in sustaining the cultural and intellectual life of our Commonwealth. It means a lot to me personally to bring everyone together tonight to celebrate Berea and the other supporting organizations gathered here. Thank you to you all, and know that you always have a collaborating friend in the Filson. Now it's my honor and privilege to introduce tonight's speaker. Gretchen Dykstra is the author of Echoes from Wuhan, The Past as Prologue, and Civic Pioneers, Local Stories from a Changing America, 1895 to 1915, and co-author of Pinery Boys, Songs and Song Catching in the Lumberjack Era. She earned degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Bank Street College of Education. She's written articles for several publications, including the New York Times and California History. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks, Patrick. And thank you all for coming. It is a real thrill for me to see the size of this crowd in Louisville, where I've never been before. And I don't want to brag, but I am going to brag. I walked 16,000 steps today, exploring your downtown. Thank you. And yesterday I walked 12,000. I don't want to, I will say that, boy, you've got some beautiful buildings in Louisville. It's too bad you pulled so many of them down. But I'm not going to focus on that. I want to focus on Berea because it's such a good news story. And so again, thank you for coming. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for Scott. And thank you for the University Press of Kentucky. But most of all, thank you for Berea. And with that, I'd like Chad and Lisa Berry to stand up. If you don't know them, you should. Come on, come on. So why did I ask them to stand up? Because they are the reason why I wrote a book about Berea. And no, I'm not from Kentucky. I grew up outside of Philadelphia and lived in New York City for 50 years. But in June of 2011, I saw a little 1-inch ad in the Atlantic Monthly that said, "Visit Appalachia with Berea College." My grandmother, who lived in Cincinnati throughout the Depression, had told me about Berea, but I didn't remember any of the details, but I remembered her enthusiasm. And I'd never been to Appalachia, and I am an incorrigible traveler, so I signed up. And for 1 week in June of 2011, I spent an extraordinary week with Lisa and Chad Berry and 20 other people. We spent a day and a half at Berea with lectures on everything from Central Appalachian's history to its humor, to its religion, to the demographics, all interesting. And then we took 5 days and visited in Southern Virginia, Tennessee, dipped into Western Virginia, and then came through the Cumberland Gap to go back to Berea. And at the Cumberland Gap, when we pulled up to a kind of a funky motel for the night, we were in a big white bus, by the way. You couldn't miss us. When we got off the bus, there were about 10 big burly white guys on motorcycles. And one of them said, "Where are you all from?" And somebody said, "Berea College." And with that, all 10 of those guys gave us the thumbs up and roared away. And I thought, I don't think I've ever seen that before. I don't think I've ever seen a college where people outside of the community give a thumbs up. And I thought, And then we spent a day and a half in Berea, and I was blown away, in part, listening to Chad and also at that time the head of admissions. So here I am writing a book about Berea, not so much its history, but about modern, contemporary Berea. Because as a New Yorker, I've got to tell you, very few people have heard of Berea. But I think Kentucky, you have in your embrace a national treasure. And I think more people should know about Berea. And I think Kentucky should, in fact, be celebrating Berea every day of its existence. Yes. Berea was very kind to me, and in October, when the book was launched, we did it at Berea, and there were 1,000 students listening to my opening comments, which was wonderful. But after it, we met with a group of students who had questions, and one very smart, as many of them are, student said to me, well, Berea is part of the University Press of Kentucky, and you've written a celebration of Berea. Where's the conflict? And I thought, ooh, what a good question that young man is asking. What a good question. So I first said, well, you should know that as an author for an academic press, I make zero money. And I mean zero money. So there's no monetary conflict there. I said, but more importantly, you should know, and I want all of you to know, that I spent the better part of, I think, 6 or 7 years going back to Berea. And the college never once asked me who I was talking to. They never once asked to read anything I wrote. They never once stopped me from going to any class that the professor would say I could go into. And they never once said that I couldn't talk to every student. And so I said to that young man, there's no conflict here. Think of this as an unauthorized biography, which means that nobody is endorsing it. And so I'm thrilled to see how many people are interested in hearing about Berea. Now, Berea, as you may or may, oh, let me take a moment. How many people here are alums from Berea? 1, 2, 3. Hey. Maybe those alums know that Berea now is organized around what they call the 8 Great Commitments, and there it's listed on the slide. There was somebody at Berea named Chris Lakes, who I once had a long talk with him, and he was a PhD student at the University of Kentucky in higher education. And when he got to one of his seminars, the professor was the retired president of LSU. And there were about 8 or 10 people in this graduate seminar, and the LSU guy said to each of them, I want you to come back the next time we meet and bring the mission statement from your individual colleges. So they did, and he started with Chris Lakes, and Chris said, I went to Berea, and the guy said, you stop. And Chris Lakes' heart dropped. He thought, oh, they don't think I belong here because I went to Berea. They went around the room talking about the mission statements from these other colleges back to Chris. And the guy from LSU said, I want you all to listen to this. Berea College is the only college in America that has a mission statement that actually guides the work it does. And so that's how I organized the book. But I want to start by saying that I gave a lot of thought in all of my time to what makes Berea so wonderful. And yes, it's its history, but it's also the tradition of respecting that history and yet also innovating around that history. And you're going to hear about some of it tonight. But I want to start with John Fee. How many of you know much about John Fee? Raise your hand. Oh, good. Not too much. Good. I like talking to people who don't know more than me. So John Fee was the son of a tobacco farmer in northeast Kentucky who went to Miami of Ohio and Augusta College. His father had 13 slaves on his tobacco and hemp farm. John Fee graduated from college, and then he went to Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati. He says in his autobiography that he spent a lot of time with African-American slaves on his parents' property, but he hadn't ever thought about slavery until he got to Lane Theological, and 2 of his classmates lectured him on why he hadn't thought about that. So John Fee left. Well, actually, his father made him leave Lane when he announced that he had become an abolitionist. But he had already been ordained as a Presbyterian minister, so he returned to Kentucky and became an itinerant minister. Sometimes he would preach in front of 3 people. Sometimes he would go to homes where there might have been 10 or 15. Sometimes he was invited into churches. And the Presbyterian Church had come out against slavery, but John Fee said to those ministers, you criticize adultery, you criticize lying, you criticize cheating. Why don't you criticize owning slaves? And they refused to do that, so John Fee left the Presbyterian Church. He never left his faith, and this is an important piece of that, because his faith was basically built on the idea that you love your neighbor as you would love yourself. That's the fundamental belief of Christianity. So he left, but in the course of doing his itinerant work, he had met Cassius Clay. And Cassius Clay, and one of the things I learned in writing this book, I should have known it, but I didn't, that the abolition movement was sort of divided between those who wanted to do it quickly and those who wanted to do it slowly. Those who thought it was immoral and those who thought it was economically foolish. That was the source of the respect and the tension between John Fee and Cassius Clay. But Cassius Clay gave John Fee 10 acres of land south of Lexington, about, I'm going to say an hour, on a ridge overlooking the foothills of the Appalachians, with the understanding that he would start an interracial community on this ridge. That was in 1855, and John Fee started a school, the first school in the South to educate both men and women, boys and girls, black and white. And in those early days, they ranged in age from 7 years old to 29. And John Fee became a bit of a hero among Northern abolitionists. And in 1859, he was invited, well, he went on a fundraising tour, but he was invited by Henry Ward Beecher, who was the famous minister in a church in Brooklyn Heights in New York, to preach at that church. He preached about John Brown. He didn't support his violence, but he supported the instincts behind fighting for the end of slavery. Well, like rumors today and Fox News today, that got back to Kentucky, and word got out that John Fee was in fact a supporter of violent overthrow of the South. And so when John Fee was gone, still on his trip, 65 armed guys came to Berea and told them all to leave. And so his wife, his children, and a few other people who had joined him at Berea left the ridge, and they would be gone until 1864, 1865, 1864. In that time, John Fee went to Camp Nelson, which became the recruiting center for African American soldiers, and he preached at night and taught during the day. And he recruited other teachers from the North, from the American Missionary Association, who came down to meet him and teach these black soldiers at Camp Nelson, and their families, I might add. One of the things, again, a lesson I learned, which I had never focused on, was an abolitionist does not necessarily mean somebody who embraces equal opportunity. And John Fee met and was impressed by a young African-American woman named Belle Mitchell, who was educated, and he got her to come to Camp Nelson to teach also with him and his team at Camp Nelson. They had 700 students, by the way. She came, and the white abolitionists from the North were very happy she was there, but they refused to eat dinner with her. And this went on for a couple of nights. John Fee had to go, and the head of Camp Nelson told her she had to leave. Belle Mitchell left, and her brother-in-law ended up being the first black graduate of Berea College, which actually is going to be one of the themes of what I talk about, which is the intentionality and the cohesion of Berea's mission. So John Fee came back from Camp Nelson in 1860, when was it? 65, I'm looking at Chad. For those of you who don't know, Chad was the head of the Appalachian Center at Berea and is an American historian of some note. So I'm nervous in front of Chad. He came back to Berea. He recruited staff a lot from Oberlin College. The few buildings were burnt down, not once, but twice. They would rebuild them. And in 1901, John Fee died. Luckily, he died before the day law was passed. In 1904, the state of Kentucky passed a law that said there could be no integrated colleges in Kentucky. And it was aimed at Berea, and they had to exclude all the African Americans at Berea at that time. What did Berea do? It took half of its money and built a new campus outside of Louisville for Black students called the Lincoln Institute. But before they did that, they actually sued, and they went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 1908, it lost at the Supreme Court. And Eric Foner, the very famous Civil War historian, said to me in a letter that that case, the Day Law case, substantiated Plessy versus Ferguson at the Supreme Court that said separate but not equal was okay. That's what he said was the incredible impact of the Day Law. They lost at the Supreme Court. No Black students were there until 1950, where Berea then began to re-enroll Black students and, in fact, live up to its mission. So today, what is Berea? Berea has somewhere between 1,500 and 1,600 students. 45% come from Kentucky. 37% come from other places in central Appalachia. The rest come anywhere from the country. 7% come from 71 different countries. And Berea has a little rule that every country can only send 2 students. But when you go to Berea's campus, you will be aware of this incredible diversity, and not just how we think of it as Black or white, but in fact, all around the world, you'll see this. Today, 50% of the kids are Black or Latino. Every single kid at Berea is under the poverty line. Every single kid. Last year, the average income of the families that sent their kids to Berea was $27,000 a year. Everybody gets free tuition, and every student works 10 to 20 hours a week. And we'll come back to that and the brilliance of their labor program. So what is the lesson that I learned from that beginning, which is, yes, it's one of a kind, but does it have to be the only one of its kind? But at the moment, it is one of its kind. There are a few other colleges that give free tuition, like the Naval Academy, West Point, but none of them give free tuition only to poor kids. And that, in fact, is what makes Berea special. I happen to think that the secret sauce is in the admissions, because what the work those people do to identify young people of real potential who are persistent to overcome the cycle of poverty, who also have shown in their early years a dedication to service, either service to their family, service to the community. Chad once said to me that the admissions either looks for kids that are already Berean or have the potential to become Berean. And I thought that was a wonderful way of describing what the admissions office does. But Luke Hodson, who's the head of admissions, he grew up in Knott County, Kentucky, where when he was growing up, the poverty rate was 76%. He came to Berea as a basketball player, and he said he quickly learned that basketball was a wonderful addition to Berea, but the real emphasis was on academics and service. And he got down to business, and he's now the head of admissions. And he said to me, and I thought this was both poetic and wonderful, he said, our task is to look for success before we look for the sob stories. Think about that. They're talking to kids who are 16 and 17 years old, and they're asking them to, what is the secret of your success to be able to be persistent about being not as poor as where you're coming from? So I'd like to read you. I'm going to do this, by the way, periodically. I'm going to go in and out of the book if you'll bear with me. But then you're here because of the book, right? So Alicia Riley, she's the Deputy Director of Admissions. She graduated in 2012. She grew up in Lewis County, Kentucky, where her mother worked in a shoe factory and her father, who had a 7th grade education, was a tobacco farmer before becoming disabled. In high school, she was ineligible to take the 2 advancement places courses offered, so she took honors classes wherever she could. She earned several business certificates from the local vocational school. She worked about 20 hours a week at the local newspaper and participated in the school's marching band. Her high school bus driver, whose son was a freshman at Berea, first told her about the college, and every time their paths crossed, the bus driver urged her to apply. At Berea, Alicia majored in elementary education, and then, graduating debt-free, she went on for her master's in counseling at Morehead State University before landing a job at Gear Up, which focuses on college readiness. She flourished at Gear Up, working for 5 years throughout eastern Kentucky and West Virginia. Then she returned to Berea saying, "I wanted to give back to the college that gave me so much," she said. Riley now shepherds from 70 to 80 students through the application process. I call, I email, I text them or their parents, sometimes as often as 10 times. Our stories are an important part of who we are, but how we overcome those challenges are just as important. And we look for people who have already shown determination. That's the grit. And that's Alicia Riley, talking about the head, the heart, and the hands. What was the lesson I learned in getting to know the admissions people? And by the way, there are 25 to 30 of them. The overwhelming majority all went to Berea. What did I learn? I learned, seek and ye will find. And that stands in stark contrast. I don't want to get political, but this is not about affirmative action. This is about the understanding that if you look hard and you talk long, you will find young people who are in fact worthy and capable of a really good, hard education in order to make the world a better place. And that is what Berea is doing. And although this isn't in my notes, I want to tell you about one girl because it just touched my heart. She grew up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And when I met her, I asked her, as I did all the kids I met. And by the way, some people said, "Oh, Gretchen, you just cherry picked. You just wrote about the good kids." I said, I wrote about every kid I met. They're all like this. So she was in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And I said to her, "How did you get into Berea?" And like every other kid, she said, "I don't know." So I pushed a little bit. So I said, "Well, how did you hear about Berea?" One Saturday, she had gone to her junior high school soccer game. She was on the team, and they had won. She was exhausted, got home, and her mother said, "We're going to your high school's college fair." She didn't want to go, but her mother dragged her. They met the guy from Berea who had a booth. Her mother got all excited about the free tuition and the labor program. The girl couldn't have cared less. She was exhausted. And the Berea guy said to the young people who were at the booth, "You know, I've arranged for a classroom after the fair is over if anybody wants to continue to talk about Berea." So her mother dragged her with other kids to hear about Berea. And I was thinking she was getting tired of my questions. And then she said to me, but I suddenly realized Berea was a special place when on Wednesday, that guy showed up at my father's funeral. And I said, "Wait a minute, your father had died that week?" And she said, "Yes." And she went to her soccer game. She went to a college fair. She asked good questions, and she realized Berea is a special place because they cared about me. That's the kind of stuff that the admissions office does. So what do the kids find when they get to Berea? It's a 4-year, very difficult liberal arts education. But today, the 3 top majors are computer science, biology, and business. So how does Berea inject liberal arts into students who are interested in jobs in majors that will produce jobs? Well, every student has to take 20 courses outside their major. And here I'm going to quote sweet Tristan Tillery. Tristan Tillery, who graduated, he's going to graduate, no, he graduated in June. He thought to him, I asked him, what do you think about the requirement of taking 20 courses outside your major? And he said, oh my goodness, that seems like a lot, but now I understand Berea wants us to explore as much as possible, and in my case, it changed me. Tillery lived for 8 years with his grandparents in Northeast Kentucky before they all moved to Southern Ohio, where he attended a small private STEM school that gave financial support to low-income students. He entered Berea thinking he'd major in biology and eventually become a psychiatrist. Quote, but then I took a class on medieval animals. We read fables and studied bestiaries and analyzed how and why the perception of some animals has changed over time. Owls went from being harbingers of death to symbols of wisdom, and I began to see myself in history more than in neuroscience. He changed his major to history. And then convocations. And convocations are a Berea tradition. Every student from freshmen through seniors, although seniors get a little bit of a break, have to go every semester. There are 13 convocations. Most of them happen in the afternoon, late in the afternoon, so as many people can come as possible. They are presented with a range of topics and activities. Students must go to 7 of the 13. They are told about what's to be expected. They have to sign in so they get credits for being there. So when they go to 7 of the 13, they have gone to almost 28 convocations by the time they've graduated. Here, 52, page 52. Designed to expand students' intellectual, cultural, and aesthetic experiences, the convocations introduce a wide world to students, few of whom have had such opportunities, and encourage exploration of the new. The students receive information about and expectations for proper behavior at the events. Attendance is taken, and they are encouraged to ask questions or offer thoughts at the end of each. Curious about wind instruments? How about the Philadelphia Brass Quintet playing fanfare to jazz? What about reproduction policies in modern China? Ever hear about the Harlan Renaissance? Those are all topics. Those are all convocations. Gertrude Mbwebe, who will graduate this June, a nursing student from Zambia, arrived at Berea soon after her single mother died unexpectedly, and readily admits that she was homesick. However, music has always comforted her, so she makes a point of choosing musical performances. She particularly liked the blind blues singer Jaron Paxton, who sang and played the guitar, a banjo, and a harmonica. Cadman Brewer, who will also who graduated last June from Greenup County, Kentucky, majored in political science and remembers well the convocation entitled Conservatives on the Quad. Quote, I had never thought about a conservative view of college, he said. For his part, Dr. Jonathan Marks, the conservative writer and thinker who gave the lecture, wrote, I thoroughly enjoyed my visit to Berea. One can feel a rich history, and I was really impressed with how they've incorporated convocations into the life of the college. And just because I think it's important, the Wall Street Journal this year listed the 10 best colleges for different reasons in the country, and Berea was number 9. The Washington Monthly, which is a well-respected magazine in Washington, has been reviewing colleges for years. And unlike the U.S. News and World Report, which we all know about, they use 3 criteria. They look at social mobility, how many graduates go on for terminal degrees in their major, and what emphasis is there on service. Berea was number 1 this year. It has been in the top 3 for as long as I've been checking. This year, it was number 1. So the lessons learned there, Even as students gravitate to majors that lead to jobs, colleges can still stress the liberal arts and expose all students to many ideas and disciplines. That's the lesson I learned, because now we all know that kids are doing nothing but studying to get jobs. Christianity, the third commitment, and the one, I have to be honest, gave me the greatest problem. I approached this with a fair amount of resistance, and I spent an entire week on the campus digging into this one. Berea is not a Bible school. It's not a divinity school. It's not a parochial school. It's non-denominational. But it has strong respect for John Fee and the desire for students to understand what motivated him and what he stood for. Page 62. I write better than I talk. John Fee rejected the idea that rules and structures of a church, any church, define faith or spirituality. He believed the essential Christian value is love thy neighbor as thyself, which informed his abolitionist commitment and his devotion to equality between Black and white people. His fellow Presbyterian ministers, until he left their fellowship, railed against adultery, lying, and stealing, but never condemned owning, leasing, or trading Black people. Fee found that duplicity despicable, and his radical faith during the deadliest time in our history fueled that courage. And that's what the Berea students are learning. They're learning to stand on the shoulders of their founders. I met one student, he happened to have had green hair, but that's neither here nor there, who came from North Carolina. And I asked him, I was on my way to the Danforth Chapel, and I asked him to show me the way. And I asked him what he thought about Berea's Christian commitment. And he said, well, I never go to chapel, and it's kind of unspoken, but when I came to Berea, I was a drug addict, and I lied on my application, and I flunked out. And I went home, and I got clean, and I reapplied, and they let me back in. He said, isn't that the Christian way? He said, that's what I take from Berea, that they actually do what they say they'll do. So how does Berea express that Christian commitment? Well, there's the Danforth Chapel. Danforth was on the board for a very long, long time. You know, he was the founder of Ralston Purina in St. Louis. He built 25, I believe, no, 24 chapels in colleges around America that embraced, in fact, tolerance of other religions. And the first one he built was at Berea. The Danforth Chapel, built in 1938, is built behind and inside the main education building. Why? Because they want the students to understand that the heart and the head can't be separated. They are together. And the Danforth Chapel has events, not mandatory. You don't have to go to chapel every week. You used to, but no longer. There are 17 student chaplains. They apply, they're accepted, and then they go through training every summer. And they're trained to be supportive and insightful, but not professional psychologists. And their job is to make sure that every student at Berea's campus belongs. Last year, most of them were Christian, but there was a Hindu, there was a witch, and there were 3 gay people, all of whom said that they weren't religious, but one of them said to me, I had heard the training was really good, and I wanted to take it, because as a gay person, I know that it can be a tough road to hoe, and I wanted the skills to be able to help other young people who were struggling with being gay, that they can walk away. They don't have to argue. They can walk away with their pride. And that's why I became a student chaplain. Struck me as a pretty good reason to become a student chaplain. But every student at Berea has to take a course called 310, GSTR 310. It stands for Understandings of Christianity, and I emphasize the S on the after understandings. It's taught by 10 different professors from 10 different disciplines through 10 different lenses. And here we go. Kayla Boyd, The only child of a single mother who works as a janitor in Southwest Virginia, is not religious, but does say she tries to be spiritual. I asked her why she thought the college did not require a class on understanding Judaism or understanding Islam, and she replied, if Fee had been Jewish, we'd be studying its basic values and variations too. Same if he had been a Muslim. I thought, this is a young person who has gotten that lesson learned. To encourage close reading of texts, Professor Gowler, he's one of the many professors, the students write 8 short papers and 1 long research paper on a significant topic in Christian history, theology, or practice. In the spring of 2022, those topics included, and I quote, Christian anarchism and violence, Christianity and white supremacy, Jesus on stage, Jesus Christ Superstar and Godspell, and solitude and spirituality in Christianity and Hinduism. Caedmon Brewer, a political science major who never went to Danforth Chapel or participated in campus Christian Center activities, really enjoyed 310, thinking it made him more self-reflective. His final paper was titled, quote, The Merciless Battle Between the Spiritual and the Flesh, Understanding Scorsese and Kazantzky's Portrayals of Jesus Christ. Whoa. I can't even pronounce the Greek author, and he wrote a paper about it. What was the lesson I learned from looking at that? And this, for me, it's a really important lesson. I can't tell you how many times, although it's never blatant, but it's indirect, when I talk about Berea, and I say that they all get free tuition and they're all low income, the next question implies, oh, it must be a remedial college. Oh, it must be a poor college. It must be an easy college. The lesson I learned, as low-income students do not mean easy schools. They're perfectly capable of doing incredibly hard work, which is why when people talk about the elite schools, I get crazy. I don't think I could have gotten into Berea, and I'm quite sure I couldn't have passed and graduated from Berea. The next thing is labor, probably what Berea in some ways is best known for. How did it start? In 1833, a guy named Theodore Weld, who some of you might have heard of because he became a well-known abolitionist, was hired by something called the Society for Promoting Manual Labor in Literary Institutes to travel beyond the Allegheny Mountains and try to find schools of higher education that would in fact embrace labor as well as the brain. It had grown out of industrialization, where there was a worry that there was becoming a big schism between people who did manual work and people of the mind. He found at Lane Theological a receptive college. So they started labor with those divinity students. And that's where John Fee went. John Fee worked at the printing press when he was at Lane Theological. Others made bricks, some built roads. John Fee worked at their printing press. Let me skip ahead. Henry Fairchild, who was the first formal president of Berea, John Fee saw labor as a way of paying tuition. He didn't necessarily see it as Berea now defines it, but Henry Fairchild did. And he loved being a supervisor to some of the students, and at that time it was much smaller and not as robust. But he very wisely saw that, number one, it takes a lot of time to be a supervisor of a student in a labor position. And number two, if it doesn't have relevance to education, then is it just about money? And where can there be a connection between the work you do, the dignity of work communicated to all people, well as helping to pay for college, but more importantly, in fact, perhaps finding your own passion. And that's what Berea does today. They still have a way to go, but most of the kids, every student works 10 to 20 hours a week. When you're a freshman, you are appointed to your labor assignment. Many of the students will go to facilities. They'll clean the dormitories, they'll clean the apartment, the buildings. 50 of them are assigned to the crafts program, the famous Berea crafts program. Some of them go to the forest, some of them go to the farms. But after your freshman year, you apply, and there are something like 125 different job descriptions. You apply for a job, and then you, in fact, have a labor supervisor. One thing people are blown away by when they hear this. When you graduate from Berea, you take with you an academic transcript and a labor transcript. Your supervisor doesn't give you a letter grade, but a written grade over every semester you have that labor assignment. So that is difficult to run that. Imagine running a temp service with people who can only work 2 hours a day. Sometimes they have 8 o'clock classes. So if you're going to be assigned to the cafeteria, how do you make breakfast if you're going to class at 8 and you have to get up at 6 to go to your labor assignment? It's really, really difficult to run the labor program, but they do it beautifully. And here I want to read about Hunter McDaniel. Hunter McDaniel graduated in 23. A talkative young man with a cheery personality, he grew up in Kingsport, Tennessee, in what he calls, quote, the dirtiest city in the state. When he was 3, his parents divorced, both remarried and both divorced again. Quote, my father works at Walmart. My mother stayed at home and spent her child support on foolish things. She's not reliable, he said to me forthrightly. The Office of Student Life at Berea offers day trips on many weekends, and when McDaniel first arrived, he signed up for rock climbing, something he had never done as a kid, and he was hooked. Quote, poor people don't have the time or the money to enjoy adventure, and most outdoor activities tend to be kind of bro-y, hey dude kind of thing, says this openly gay young man. McDaniel majored in health and human performance, and for his labor position, he worked in student life, trying to attract a more diverse group for the outings. He eventually became student manager of an ever-increasing list of free trips. Along with one other student, he handled all the administrative tasks for the free trips, ran the lottery system for popular events like whitewater rafting and backpacking, kept the books, and reported all finances to the program's anonymous donor. For his senior project, McDaniel surveyed what other colleges do for outdoor adventure education, why they choose that approach, and how they implement it, particularly for marginalized communities. And then he structured a possible minor for Berea to consider. Based on that work, he applied for and won the prestigious year-long Watson Fellowship to study nature-based treatments for chronic diseases and mental health issues in Scotland, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And the day I met him, he had just gotten word that he had been accepted at the University of Oregon's master program in managing adventure travel, and that's where he is now. Finding his passion, having the ability to pursue it with no debt and with all the labor experience he got. Taylor Miles, page 77. I can cry when I remember some of these students. Taylor Miles graduated in 20. She grew up in the Bible Belt of North Carolina. A tall, open, and friendly young woman, she did well in high school, but life at home was tough. Her father was an alcoholic, and her stepmother often forced her to skip school to care for her own grandchildren. Miles ran away, and the police eventually listed her as homeless. She ended up living with a kind teacher who told her about Berea. Taylor applied as an emancipated youth and was accepted. She said, quote, I loved the idea of working for my college degree, and I wanted to be far away from home. Assigned her first year to work on the college farm, she returned there every year and ended up majoring in agricultural and natural resources. wait a second, 89. I pick up on her. When Taylor graduated in 2020, she went on for a master's degree at the University of Kentucky in science translation and outreach. Now living on a 12-acre farm outside Berea that she and her husband bought, she runs the University of Kentucky's County Extension Program for young 4-H members, teaching children, quote, about ecologically sound restorative agriculture where every choice is environmentally smart, unquote. She organizes day camps, after-school activities, livestock retreats, and weekly activities in agriculture, healthy living, and expressive arts. She calls them the 4-H Great Commitments. Taylor's a wonderful, wonderful kid. Not a kid anymore. So that's the labor program. What was the lesson I learned? As colleges get more and more expensive, colleges could be far more clever about work-study opportunities and connected to the majors and internships. And let me tell you a personal story. I have some papers from my grandfather, not papers, letters, 4 of them, 4 one-page letters that I thought should go to UCLA, where he was a big cheese. So I sent a letter to the head of the research library at UCLA and said, hey, I know you have some Dykstra files. Would you like these 4 letters? They wrote back and said, no, we don't have the room for them. I wrote back and I said, we're talking about 4 letters. She wrote back and said, we don't have the staff to even file things like that. And I said, do you have work study people at UCLA? She said, of course we do. I said, well, then why aren't some of the library science majors being assigned to the library, for God's sakes? Is that so difficult? That's what I took away from Berea. Yes, it's difficult to pull it off and to do it well, but hey, people, can't we be more clever and innovative about how we connect that stuff? Kinship. That goes to the heart of what Fee cared about. And for me, the final lesson there is that Berea leans in to tension. And I want to read you one brief story. Berea does it far better than I ever could on that kind of difficult issues. So a white kid from Eastern Kentucky who hung out with a group of other white young men on campus was heard using offensive and threatening language. Quote, it was neo-Nazi stuff, explained Chanel Barber, who at that time was head of Office of Student Affairs. She summoned the student to chat with her, and it soon became clear that he had been bullied at home by his tougher big brothers. Then it came out that he had a black sister, Barber said to me. I did not ask him why. Too many Berea kids have complicated family lives with multiple fathers and mothers. But I asked him what he would do if anyone did or said ugly things to his sister. And he burst out crying, saying over and over and over that he loved his sister. There he was, sobbing in my office. Steps to understanding and sharing kinship can be steep. And as Jessica Klenderud, an American historian, director of the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education, said, quote, poverty makes equals of everyone at Berea until it doesn't. Racism is not personal, it's societal, and sometimes it's psychological. So community. Well, sustainability I'll first do. So again, a little bit of history. This is a history that I get a real kick out. You probably know Berea has a farm that is about 500 acres and a forest that's now 9,300 acres. Silas Mason was the founder of the forest at Berea. He came from Kansas, by the way, and he began to sustainably manage the small but growing forest at Berea for poor people, just as Gifford Pinchot was doing the same for Vanderbilt at the Biltmore in North Carolina. So the Biltmore, too, was experimenting in sustainable forestry, this idea that you can have a healthy forest and also produce responsibly money from that harvest. Both of them were doing it, but guess who got all the attention? Vanderbilt and Gifford Pinchot, not Berea and Silas Mason. Jump ahead. In 2013, the state of California passed what is known as a cap and trade program. And it's somewhat controversial among environmentalists. Not all love it, but you'll see why it benefits Berea. A cap and trade program means that a company that uses a great deal of fossil fuels, like a utility company, is capped how much they can use. But they are allowed to buy carbon credits from an organization, a company, or a not-for-profit that doesn't use their carbon. Berea heard that, and now Berea is the only college in America that has sold its carbon credits. And in 2019, it received a check for $3.3 million for never having cut down a lot of the old growth trees. They signed a lease for 99 years, and every year, depending on what the market produces, they will get a check for continuing to manage their forest sustainably. With that money funds the Forest Outreach building, which maybe some of you have been to because it's at the pinnacles, it's at the hiking trails, and all of the staff that runs the forest program. But sustainability is also in the classrooms. Here, I'm going to read you about Rachel Hiding, and I'm being told I'll speed this up. Rachel, sunny and open, was elected student president of the Office of Sustainability, an agricultural and natural resources major. She had studied, thanks to Berea, permafrost in Alaska, eco-farming in Hawaii, and soil science in Malaysia. And her final labor position was managing the Green Office Certification Program. In that role, she helps academic departments and dormitories source green products, make sensible purchases, conserve water and energy, recycle and reuse, and compete campus-wide for the Green Ribbon. After her graduation in 2021, Rachel landed a summer internship back in Alaska, working on a lion's mane mushroom farm and living in a 1985 Toyota Dolphin camper, which she says, with all the original furnishings, she happily reports. So the lesson I take from that is look for innovation everywhere, not just among the privileged. Entrepreneurs come in many different stripes, and I met them at Berea over and over and over again. So community, the last one, service to Appalachia. Henry Fairchild first began community programs in 1873, distributing books into the mountains. Berea's mission to educate low-income students with an eye towards breaking the cycle of poverty, so it has defined community, not just the town of Berea, although it does a lot there, but also the communities of where many of the students come from. Taylor Boggs, 154. Taylor Boggs graduated in 23, grew up in Whitesburg, Kentucky, and knows the mountains and the trees well. When we met over lunch at the local Mexican restaurant in Whitesburg, it was the summer of his junior year. He was back home running the Gowan Community Action Group summer camp program. Responsible for 320 kids, Boggs designed the program, divided among 8 week-long sessions, handled all the administrative details, and supervised 9 student staff members. A major in elementary education, Boggs was intent on returning to Whitesburg, where qualified, certified teachers, particularly men, are desperately needed. Because he was spending the summer in his hometown working for a not-for-profit organization relevant to his major, Berea's Office of Internships and Career Development supported his paid placement, and Berea's Appalachian Fund gave the funds to pay all the camp counselors. The Appalachian Fund was founded by Herbert Favre. His factory was in Cincinnati. He invented Formica. Faber and his wife established the Appalachian Fund in 1950 to support nursing programs, including Berea's, and medical clinics throughout the region. When the foundation ceased operations in 1987, their son gave the foundation's remaining assets to Berea College, asking that the funds continue to support health and education in the mountains. $5 million has grown to $14 million. And every year, one part-time staff person, now Davy King, distributes about $500,000 from the Appalachian Fund to grassroots organizations in Eastern Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia for projects initiated and managed by local organizations. As Tyler Boggs says, the future teacher in Whitesburg, quote, "Berea is everywhere and helps to connect me back to the mountains that I love so much." So how do they do it? There the lesson learned is I'm curious, how do other colleges define community? And in fact, that's becoming a bit an obsession with me. But that is an interesting question. Berea defines community by who are the students and what do they need from us. So finally, the money. How does Berea do what it does? Well, it's been raising money since the beginning. Cassius Clay, you could argue, was its first major donor. Today, Berea's endowment is the 51st largest in the United States, but it's the only college in America that spends the interest from its endowment only on students, and it has since 1920. Unlike many not-for-profits, it has never dipped into its endowment. When there are hard times, they pull their belt in, they don't drop the students, and they don't drop their free tuition promise. It's only one of 13 colleges in the United States that gets a AAA rating from Moody's. Think about that. The only college in America that funds nothing but poor students, that gets a AAA rating from Moody's. Why? Because Berea is conservative. It's conservative, it's not political, in pursuit of a progressive agenda that's been part of their histories from the beginning. So Berea might have been radical at the beginning, but it no longer is, but it attracts independent thinkers and gives them agency and opportunities to question and probe and pursue passions. That endowment, which is now hovering near $2 billion, comes primarily from alums. Yes, it comes from people like myself who never went there and never could have gone there. From current students, it raises money from their labor assignments, and it has a few major donors. The American Missionary Association was key in the early days. Midwestern industrialists who knew about it were important. Even President Woodrow Wilson did a fundraiser for Berea at one point. So, in fact, their biggest job is to continue to keep that endowment high, to follow their mission. But what I take away from it is what's special about Berea is not only that it's unique, pursuing a mission that nobody can object to, but it does it with total respect to its history, even as it looks towards the future. Thank you very much for coming. It's been a joy.
We've filled up our time very effectively, I shall say. I would like to get one question in from the chat because this one came in very early in the presentation, and they don't have the opportunity to ask questions in the book signing line like we all do. So someone asked, in your research, did you explore anything about the foundation school at Berea College from 1911 to 1968?
Only in passing, because I decided to focus on contemporary Berea. I know the foundation school existed. I've met alums who went there, but I didn't spend much time on that, no.
Fair enough. Thank you all so much for joining us
I'm
tonight.
sorry I didn't leave enough time for questions, but I'll be here
Plenty
if
of
you
time
have any
outside.
for us. Thank you all.